It's a real pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. And I want to start by congratulating Ajay Chhibber on his excellent book, Unshackling India, which will serve as a backdrop to this discussion. 75 years into independence, this is a very appropriate time to take stock of the economic scorecard. And there's many positives on that report card, right? GDP growth averaged about 4% for the first 45 years of independence, but has since accelerated and averaged almost 7% for the last 30 years, which is no mean feat, and has dramatically reduced poverty and improved livelihoods. But the agricultural sector has gone from deficits to large surpluses. Exports grew from 10% of GDP at the start of the millennium to peak at about 25% of GDP before falling back to about 20%. And we've seen many sectoral successes, which we'll talk about. We have a world-class IT sector, and we now have the fifth largest, we're the fifth largest auto producers in the world. So there's a lot to be proud of and a lot to take heart from. But equally, several challenges loom. First among which is to restore growth momentum in this post-pandemic world, the challenge of creating jobs, boosting labor force participation, particularly women's labor force participation, improving health and educational outcomes, and creating broader and smarter safety nets. So there's a lot we need to rededicate ourselves to in this post-pandemic world. And I can think of no better panel to analyze all of these issues. So since the topic today is looking back and looking forward, let's start by looking back. And may I ask all of our panelists to spend about 3 or 4 minutes presenting their economic scorecard of the first 75 years. I'm going to start with Dr. Shankar Acharya, who is India's longest serving chief economic advisor, and therefore was in a unique position to judge this scorecard both from inside and outside. So Dr. Acharya, may I start by asking you how you would present India's scorecard on the 75th anniversary?
Well, thank you very much, Sajjid. I also want to thank Asia Society and Inabti for inviting me onto this program. I think your summary, by the way, was excellent, Sajjid. So I kind of feel that we can stop this conversation right here, and you can just have, drinks and canapes after this, or whatever you do normally in a live context. But let me, in the 2 or 3 minutes for this opening remarks, say what I would say are the 4 or 5 things over the last 75 years that I would highlight. I mean, there are lots of things, as you said, but I would highlight. First, as you also touched upon this, you mentioned growth between sort of first 4 decades being kind of around 4% a year, and then averaging 6.5%, 7% since until about 2019, 2020. And of course, that's very important. I think also, but even the first 4 decades, if you compare to the previous 50, that is during colonial times, it is, I think, important to have that perspective in mind. Unlike most of you, I was actually born to colonial India, probably unlike all of you. And it's important to remember that growth was really between, according to Angus Madison and folks like that, was about between 0.5% to 1%. And per capita income hardly grew at all. So even the 3.5%, 4%, which we now deride, and rightly so in terms of what other countries have done, but compared to our own history of this, the 20th century anyway, it wasn't that bad. Secondly, I'd like to point out a key number, which is that our life expectancy in 1947, as far as I remember, was somewhere between 32 to 35. Different sources give different numbers. And as you know, by 2020, before the pandemic, it had reached almost 70, with women typically living a couple of years longer than men. And that's more than doubled during this time. Now, again, other countries perhaps may have done better, but it's no mean feat to go from somewhere around 30s to somewhere around 70. Thirdly, I think that an important part of our development success in more recent years has been our ability to increase our savings and investment rates over the 70 odd years that we're talking about. they were much more in the range of 5 to 10% near independence. Now, as we know, if it dips below 30%, we get anxious and say, what the hell is going on? And lastly, I think particularly in the last 30 years, we have become, I think, much more economically integrated with the rest of the world, which was not the case until somewhere around the late 80s, 1991, thereabouts. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jha. That's a wonderful springboard from which to move on. Let me turn to Naina and to get her perspectives and her scorecard. Being a veteran in the financial services sector and industry leader, Naina, Dr. Acharya spoke about how savings rates have moved up. So apart from other things, would love to get your perspective on how the financial sector has grown, how credit has deepened, and how that has supported the 7% growth that we've seen over the last 3 decades.
Sajjid, just on the financial sector, I was actually going to put it on my negative lists rather than the plus, because we still have a banking sector that is under capacity for the nature of growth we require, and a bond market which is highly disappointing in terms of what is required of it to fund growth. And then also the way we have a transition from a banking sector, as in credit, that is given for projects typically of shorter tenor than is required, and the ability of companies to switch from the banking sector to a bond market, which is quite important as we look at longer tenured finance. So I think this failure is something that has to be addressed very quickly if we want to see the sort of growth we want. And I think it also is evident in the fact that the growth we see in terms of digital, IT, etc., comes from sectors which are not very credit heavy, or whereas the very sectors that need it are ones that we need to nurture and grow. So much to be done there. One big success within it is, I think, the microfinance industry. It's had its share of ups and downs, political mess-ups at the state level. But having said all that, embedded in the self-help group movement in the country, and microfinance is, I think, a huge success story. And we can grow off it and on it to create livelihoods and bring women into the economic workforce. Now, the danger therein also is that recognizing its success, we begin to burden it with more and more. And that is indeed happening, because you have the self-help groups, so let's get them to do, every government program. And that would, of course, be a shame, because we would, in fact, destroy through the sheer burden on these women what is already a pretty effective mechanism. But that's really in the world of finance. I want to touch on an area which I work in, which is water and sanitation. And I would say, looking back on 75 years, one of our biggest failures has been our ability to manage water. We are not a desert. We are not a water-short country. But the way we have managed our water resources and the failure of policies to recognize effective water management in agriculture, and we're primarily agrarian, 75% of water use and abuse is in agriculture. And then, of course, industry, consumption, poor management, poor regulation, there's no end to it. Effluent control, and, all of that has been, I think, really because we just did not have adequate holistic policies in water. The good news is I work in sanitation is indeed the success story in sanitation today. What we have seen in terms of progress from 40% ODF-free sort of status to what I think is nearer 80%, even though the government does tom-tom 100. But this is a huge journey, and not just because of what it does in terms of ODF, but therefore brings with it health, jobs. There's a study, in fact, by UNICEF, which says from 2014 to 2019, 75.5 lakh jobs have been created through the SBM, Swachh Bharat mission activity. And I think I would just endorse the fact that as we spend in infrastructure, if we look at infrastructure such as water and sanitation, the dividends that would yield much more than large mechanized roads, where maybe labor intensity is far lower, We have to look at infrastructure spends in spaces where job creation and labor intensity is good, but of course, public goods themselves come forth well. I would just add gender to my list of woes. I think we do have a lot of women-centric programs, but until we are able to change social norms and society and all the programs come together in a much more meaningful way, regulation, police, how you report rapes. I mean, it is, there's a lot to be done, whether at the social level, economic level. And I think where we have found that women have been brought into the process, and they're being brought in now, for example, through water sanities to manage water resources, where women came in through self-help group movements, we have seen huge success. So really organizing women to engender change and would be very central, but also therefore to benefit from that. And I would just end by saying that in terms of success stories, I think India having embraced the renewables agenda and to stop fighting on the basis of per capita carbon and the pressures of the West, and rightly demanding that we will grow at the cost of climate and per capita climate and carbon generation, the rest of the world. But in our fight to do that, we lost, I think, almost a decade of also doing the right thing for ourselves. And the good news now is that with the renewable energy agenda and embracing the green growth, we recognize that it is good for us, even while we play on an international stage. So that's from me, Sajjid.
Thank you, Naina. Those are wonderful opening comments because they bring into stark relief just the importance of sustainability over the next 25 years, whether it's climate, whether it's water, whether it's female labor force participation, all of which will be crucial for growth in the next 2.5 decades. Let me turn to Ganesh. Ganesh, from your perspective, you work both in sustainability and technology. Your sense of what the scorecard is over the last 75 years?
I'll give you a typical digital guy's answer, but you can't really generalize that one. But I mean, let me split it into 5 parts and very quickly. And we just wrote a book on Rising to the India Challenge, which actually won the Best Book Award just 3 months ago. And for that, we actually researched various facets of Indian growth vis-a-vis, of course, China's growth. And currently we're writing it's almost like a follow-on to Ajay's book, which is what we call Pathways to 2030, saying that, look, what are the areas, and some of them Naina already alluded to, which we should really focus on. But if I split up your question into 5 parts, I mean, one is, of course, the classical growth processes of agriculture, industry, services. I mean, we all know that we've done extremely well in services. Okay, IT services clearly stands out, and that's something we have seen. I really think agriculture is a bit of a problem because we really haven't got our act in place on what we should be producing, first of all, and then how we should produce it. Industry, mixed bag. If I look at it over 75 years, I mean, we all know about the permit Raj and everything else. But today we are in a situation where successful industrialists, and it's not just the Tatas and the Birlas and the Mahindras, but people like Mr. Adani and of course Mr. Ambani have shown that, look, you invest deeply and are able to really place your bets on India, you can make a big thing. So I think that's good role models that we have today. If you look at the economic policies, I'm not the expert at all, but I mean, I keep chatting with my friend Ajit Ranade. And the belief that we have is that, look, I mean, with all the free trade agreements we sign abroad and what we do in the economy, hopefully the continuity of policy that Finance Minister talked about for the next 25 years, we'll see some changes there. But moving from an era of signing FTAs and having bilateral agreements to a truly multilateral approach to positioning India, I mean, as we want to be at the center of economic policy in the world, hopefully that will happen. And that is also linked with diplomacy, which I won't get into at this point of time. The third big success story in the making is, of course, Digital India. And I think there's been a lot of talk, unfortunately, I mean, oscillating between the two terms of BharatNet and the National Optic Fiber Network. We still haven't seen enough of penetration into the 250,000 gram panchayats or, of course, the 600,000 villages. But hopefully, Prime Minister Modi's promise in the Independence Day speech, what Nirmala ji talked about in the finance minister's budget speech, we will see that happen. Because unless you have good physical, digital, and social infrastructure, and maybe I'll come back to that in the second part, we're not going to get anywhere. And I think that's a significant failure, the way I see it is, of both physical and digital. And social, of course, is everything that Naina spoke about, which is very, very important. What we are suddenly seeing take off after I think Whitson starts is the entrepreneurship boom, because the whole startup ecosystem, and don't get carried away with the 72 unicorns, because as Prime Minister Modi said in the Lok Sabha 2 days ago, it's important that these unicorns actually become global multinationals. You don't want several flashes in the pan, which just don't scale, but clearly signs of something happening in the right direction. But the biggest disappointment for me, without exception, I grew up, first 15 years of my life I spent in probably the most backward village in the most backward state in the country, a little village called Patissilvai near Ranchi in what then Bihar and now Jharkhand. And my best friend was a little village boy called Fantush. And Fantush, I went back and found him 3-4 years ago. While I had found my beanstalk, which was education, and moved out of Jharkhand and Ranchi to Mumbai, to London, to San Jose, and then, built a career, Fantush still gets 7,000 rupees per month if he's lucky. And nothing has changed for him. When a family of 3 children, he worships the government of the day because, he believes that they will save him, but has been saved over the last 40 years. It's anybody's ask. So I think that's a big issue. And the reason why I spend 60% of my life today on livelihoods is I genuinely believe that we have failed the poor people of India. Now, whether you call this recovery K-shaped or whatever shape you call it, I think the people at the bottom of the pyramid, the 400 million people who are asking for jobs and better jobs, they have to be served. So I think whatever we do, whether it's Digital India, services, manufacturing, or Make in India Part 2, or the whole new industrial movement that's happening, I think that has to be the priority, apart from the other SDGs and everything that we have to look at. So I think that's really where I would be. So very mixed bag. Some areas where entrepreneurs have been successful, has been globally world-class, but a lot needs to be done, in my opinion, and needs to be done in the next 25 years and then the next 75.
Thank you, Ganesh. That's a wonderful summary. I've consciously left Ajay to be the last speaker in the first round because he's written a whole book analyzing India at 75. So Ajay, I would love to get your perspectives, your findings from the book. Ganesh touched upon several of these issues: premature deindustrialization, safety nets, the challenge of jobs. So Ajay, the floor is yours. What is the scorecard 75 years in?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sajjid. Thank you for the nice words about the book. It's right here behind me. And thank you, Inakshi, for putting this together. And such a honor to have part of this panel. And the best endorsement on our book actually came from Shankar Acharya. So I valued that very much. Anyway, let me just say, so yes, we wrote the book. Salman and I are from the same college and we both worked at the World Bank, but would you believe it? We only met 2 years ago and just before the pandemic. And when the pandemic came, we decided to write this book. And as it turned out, of course, we said, let's look at the last 75 years and then where India can go for the next 25 years, which we will talk about perhaps a little later. To when it reaches 2047. So we start with Prime Minister Nehru's tryst with destiny speech and then end with how we will consummate that destiny in 2047. So as we say in the book, and some of it has already been said by others, in a somewhat muddled through haphazard manner, India has of course made considerable progress since the end of British rule, certainly far better than the previous 100 years of that colonization. And most villages have now been electrified. Most of our children are going to primary schools in villages and urban slums even. Although how much they're learning, we can talk about that. Most people now use mobile phones, road and highway construction, airports, ports have been expanded to increase mobility across the country. Poverty, which had actually fallen by over 200 million people, of course, has risen again sharply due to COVID-19, but this reversal is hopefully temporary, as it was during the global financial crisis. India's ranking in global GDP has risen on the back of the 1991 reforms, which Shankar was a major designer of, as its GDP has grown more than 5 times since then, and a middle class of around 300 million has emerged, about 25% of India's population. But so has inequality. The share of income going to the top 1% has doubled from just over 10% in 1990 to over 20% in 2029. And the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, which us economists use, which was around 0.3 in 2000, has shot up to 0.48 in 29, making India the second most unequal country in the world after Russia. And COVID probably has increased the inequality even further. India has held together as a sort of a ramshackle, rambunctious democracy. But even that designation is under question by many inside and outside India, who feel it's probably better termed an electrocracy, where elections are held, but not a genuine democracy. The Indian growth model had run out of steam even before the pandemic. As we know, GDP growth had slumped back to what my old professor at the Delhi school, Raj Krishna, described as the Hindu growth rate of 4%. And over 77% of the workforce was in what we call vulnerable employment, which is that there are no work benefits, no social security. I think Ganesh already mentioned his example, Fantoosh from Bihar. So the demographic dividend is beginning to look like a demographic disaster at this point. So as it enters the 75th year of independence, India, of course, appears to be recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, but huge uncertainties lie ahead. And with things, bigger threats of climate change looming ahead. And also, of course, new technologies which India must both take advantage of, but also respond to. This has clearly been a wake-up call, the COVID, and it has cost India many lives and livelihoods. But it has also exposed major structural weaknesses in the economy's governance. I think, especially on health, but I would say more broadly, what we look at in our book is how effective has government in general been in addressing these issues, and what it has exposed is how weak the overall governance is. So conventional policy is unlikely to combat these challenges across a range of areas: human capital, technology, agriculture, finance, that Naina touched on already, trade. More new ideas must be on the table. And of course, huge problems related to, which are exemplified by the sex ratio that we have and the female labor force participation ratio. We really are functioning only on one leg, and we cannot do that if we have to make progress in the next 25 years. Thank you, Sajjid. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Ajay. A rich menu of issues to focus on. Maybe as we explore some of these issues, let me start with the role of the state, because that was at the heart of the 1991 reforms that Dr. Acharya was part of. And a lot of what we discussed will derive from the kind of state we envision over the next 25 years. So Dr. Acharya, let me get your sense of, Ajay in his book talks about India's state being more welfarist and less developmental. Hopefully that's changing. We've just had a budget, 2 budgets in a row where the focus is more infrastructure. There's some incentives for exports over the last couple of years. But more broadly, for the next quarter of a century, what kind of state do you envision? What should the state be doing? How do we increase state capacity? And how do we get different arms of the state, the center and the states, for example, to better work with each other? I know it's a daunting question, but I think you're best positioned to answer that.
Well, Sajjid, I'm not sure that I am best positioned. I think, in a sense, if one spends 15 years of one's life in a system, one sometimes gets defensive about it. But it's a very big question. But let me just touch on sort of some dimensions which I think are really challenging. First of all, I think, when we have discussions like these, we tend to focus on the role of the central government. And that's natural because, many of us are sort of around Delhi or in the metros, which relate to the sort of centers activities much more. But, India is a federation, and the constituent states are very important when it comes to the role of the state, especially when you remember something like, I forget the exact number, you probably have it at the tip of your tongue, but something like 60 to 65% of spending is really done at the state government level. So when we talk about the quality of the state, in terms of its expertise, in terms of its consistency, in terms of its efficiency, what have you. That's what really counts when the citizen, the average citizen, interacts with the state. Aside from leaving out things like central income tax and personal and corporate, almost every other governmental agency or service that one encounters in day-to-day life as an average citizen is through the state, as far as I know. Again, there are exceptions. There are the Indian Railways and so forth. So I think it's very important that when we talk about reforming government, and people tend to think about reforming central government, how to make the central services more specialized in some cases, more efficient in others, we don't forget the states, because that's, in my view, where the action is. I myself have never been an employee of a state government, but I've had a lot of friends, relatives, and so on who've spent a lot of their lives in the state government. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. Secondly, I would say that from my experience of the central government, and it's now 20 years out of date, that experience, that I think the general tendency to kind of put the generalist executive cadres, the IAS, the IFS, and so on, these are the centralized class 1 services, at the heart of things, is something that really hasn't changed much over the last 75 years. And I think when you consider where does all this come from, this basic structure really came from Britain. I mean, our colonial masters until 1947. And we haven't actually, in my view, been able to do a whole lot to change that. There have been any number of administrative reform commissions and so on, but somehow it hasn't changed all that much. In Britain itself, it's changed a lot during this period, by the way. The role of the civil services, the permanent civil services, has changed a lot in all the major ministries. It's become much more specialized. Generalist cadres still play a very important role, but the role of the specialists is recognized and valued. I'm not saying it's not recognized and valued in India, but I think it's not enough. I mean, that's why quite often, we have to kind of weave our way to a particular public policy rather than go straight to the correct one. Thirdly, of course, when you've got used to what you might call a dirigiste state system for, something like the first 50 years of existence, for 40 years of existence as a nation, it's hard to break some old habits. And while it's easy to talk the talk of, now we leave things to the market, actually when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, even today, we find it difficult necessarily to do that. I mean, when you think about inflation, anti-inflationary policies, most modern states would essentially think of monetary and fiscal policies. But we tend to also focus on stock limits of traders and things like that, which is a sort of almost Pavlovian response, which dates back several decades. So there's a long way to go in how we see all that. And of course, the important thing is where the state has, real almost monopoly role, we don't focus enough to make it as good as that can be. And the classic example of this to me, or for me, is primary and secondary education. As I think someone mentioned that, now, of course, enrollment in primary school and even secondary school is close to universal for the relevant cohorts. But when you measure by learning outcomes, it's really very, very inadequate. And what's really troubling, when you look at the surveys of this done by Pratham and others, which are done annually, as all of you know, they don't show an improvement over the last 15 years or a significant improvement. And to me, that's really very, very saddening. And I think that's a very big challenge, because I think people is what we have a lot of. we have to get used to think of people as a resource, but they have to be getting the opportunity for the decent education right down from the primary and secondary stages before we get to the tertiary. And it's without that, I think that's at the root of many other problems we see, whether it's labor force participation, whether it's lack of adequate role of manufacturing, even our foreign trade. You know, it's the lack of skilling, basic skilling, which I think is a big problem. And for that, I think the government, center and states still should and does retain the primary responsibility, but it can be much better done.
Thank you very much. Those are sobering and very important thoughts. Let me use that to ask Naina a similar question. You know, the role of the state has evolved in previous decades, but there's a sense that while the size of the state may not be exceptionally large, if you look at total expenditure to GDP, we're not out of whack with other emerging markets. The scope is too wide, that perhaps what we need to be doing fewer things and doing things better. And Dr. Acharya spoke to some of those: primary education, healthcare. Naina, from your perspective, what do we expect the state to be doing over the next 25 years differently and better? Naina, you're on mute, I believe.
Sorry about that. So I think if we can just replicate the success of programs such as Swachh Bharat and look at why did it work and how did it work, it's one of the few cases where there was complete alignment from the Prime Minister down to the Anganwadi worker and the state. The execution happened at the state level, but through a process of creating competition between states and, of course, funding that actually reached the state level, a lot of central government's funding, a lot of cajoling of the private sector to engage in partnership, pride that people took in being part of what this march forward was. There was, whether it was the communication program or the implementation, it was pretty phenomenal. Public sector companies, private sector companies, all aligning. So I would absolutely endorse, let's do a few things like this well and replicate that success, because it has been a success. And what I think is also important is we're not going to be able to just do these 5-year plans and move on. It's very clear to me that for every success, it can fall by the wayside if we don't keep moving ahead. So there has to be a system that ensures that the successes achieved in a program don't drop away, because even in sanitation, continuing maintenance, repair, keeping the livelihood creation out of it going, moving into treatment, all of this is very, very critical. So I think Shankar's spot on when he says, you know, it is really at the state level that things go ahead and don't. I just had a second point, which, we've encountered in our work in sanitation and water, and that is, it is very hard to break through systems which are entrenched. You can have a mafia for waste collection. You will have a mafia for teachers and jobs. You'll have, and breaking through some of these are really quite hard. It's almost easier to find the new. IT, I think, was a classic case where, well before the government even knew it existed, it had marched ahead. So ensuring that we can also pick those where success is easy, or breaking through these mafias, which often are caught in a web of politicians, bureaucrats, and, how do you actually break out of a system that becomes corrupt and does not actually deliver what it needs to, is very hard in entrenched sectors, and in fact keeps out the good. I'm a great one and believer in creating the ecosystem. And governance has to be about creating the right ecosystem for the private sector, for entrepreneurs, for everyone to thrive in. And the focus has to be about that right ecosystem, which goes in every aspect of governance, the regulation, how it's implemented, how it breaks through these mafias, how it encourages, how it incentivizes, how it skills, how it trains. And so it has every element of governance that has to be looked at so that that sector moves ahead. And I think we can identify these and move in very targeted ways. Every collector today has over 300 programs sitting at the district level. It's impossible for that individual to pick and choose. So we have to help them either by giving them trained manpower and help, but also, I think, by helping them prioritize what is important. And whether that prioritization happens at the central or state level or together, of course, needs to be determined.
Thank you, Naina. Ajay, I'm going to turn to you because you have this very interesting taxonomy when thinking about the state in your book, which I believe comes from some work in Israel, where you've got transaction volume on one axis, you've got specificity as a proxy for discretion on the other axis, and you kind of conclude that things which have low transaction volume but high specificity, India does well. The RBI, Election Commission, ISRO, foreign policy, higher education, tertiary health, right? But the higher transaction volume, which is sometimes less measurable, we often struggle with. So let me pose Naina's question in another way. We're very good in mission mode, whether it's building toilets, gas cylinders, bank accounts, right? But the more chronic work, primary health, primary education, is more of a slog. Why that dichotomy?
Yeah, so, there's a well-known public administration specialist at the World Bank, Arturo Israel, and he developed this taxonomy, and others have, Pritchett and others have expanded it. And in the latest book by Kelkar and Shah also, they expand it even further. But the basic idea is very straightforward. I mean, you sort of puzzle and ask yourself, how come we can do some of these things well? Like, as you said, the Central Reserve Bank of India runs reasonably well. And we've had an election commission that has run reasonably well, a space organization, but we can't seem to deliver, basic health and education. And so this taxonomy basically shows why, to some extent, and says, when you have very large volume of transactions on items which are not easily measurable. I mean, how do you measure why children are not learning? Is it the teacher? Is it the school? Is it the equipment? Is it the system of governance, etc., incentives? So he argues that these are best kind of devolved to lower levels of government, that you cannot centralize these things and run them reasonably well. And I think it goes back to what the point Shankar was making, that and of course it has to be at the state level, but I would argue it has to be even beyond the state level. Moving money from Delhi to Lucknow is not going to solve the problem. Just to give you an example, in China, which is we consider to be a fairly authoritarian, kind of totalitarian state, more than 50% of the spending is done not even at the provincial level, at the state level. It is done at the local level. In India, we are spending less than 5% at the local level, meaning mayors and panchayats, etc. So I think that framework that Arturo Israel developed helps us think through that we are not going to solve our education problem just by announcing a national education policy. It is how that will get implemented at that local level, at the sarpanch level, at the city level, that really where the solutions will come from. So that's kind of one framework that we put together in this book. And the other is, just to add a little bit to that, which is that when you look at East Asia, for example, I have spent a lot of my career working in East Asia. When they did economic reforms of the kind that we did in 1991, they then spent as much attention to the administrative reform. In China, Deng Xiaoping did his 1989 reforms. Then 15 years later came Churongji, the Prime Minister, who then did a very major reform of government, so to speak, government at the national level and government at the provincial level, because he posed the question that I have changed the laws, economic laws, but I don't have administrative machinery for the 21st century. Malaysia, many other countries, Korea, all of them have done that. India had that idea. We had set up the Moily Administrative Reforms Commission, which produced a tome of a report in 2005, but then nothing happened after that. So the point I'm trying to make is that, we are trying to run now a 21st century economy with a 19th century administrative system. And that really needs reforms. I can go into more detail on this, but let me stop here.
Thank you, Ajay. That's a very good segue for me to turn to Ganesh, because looking forward, Ganesh, how transformative can technology be in redefining the role of the state, right? So we've seen how product-based subsidies have become cash transfers as a way of perhaps disintermediating the vested interests that Naina spoke about, reducing leakages, better service delivery. Can we use technology to solve some of these more fundamental issues, primary health, primary education, where the state can leverage technology to achieve better outcomes? Ganesh?
No, absolutely, Sajjid. In fact, I'd like to actually disagree with something you said earlier, that if we go into mission mode, things are successful. Because if you look at the history, take education, for instance. I think education, I don't want to use a tough word, but it's a disaster. You go to the unpopulated classrooms across rural India, you go to some of the universities which should not even exist, and we just don't seem to know. The NEP is a step in the right direction, but as I think Ajay rightly said, that's not going to solve the problem. Similarly, healthcare. Ayushman Bharat is a great idea, but today, if you look at healthcare in the country, it's abysmal. We did a great job in vaccine distribution, vaccination, etc., but huge amounts still to be done. And if you look at the allocation in the budget, it's still, to my mind, pitifully short of what is required to transform healthcare in this country. So let me come to your question. I think, there is no alternative. I wish I could say that technology is a nice, desirable activity, but at this point of time, if you look at the problems facing us, and I'll give you two actual examples. There are two big initiatives I'm part of. One is an entity that you may have heard, started by Safina Hussain 15 years ago, called Educate Girls. And what Educate Girls has done in the rural districts of right from Pali, Rajasthan, where we began, Rajasthan to Madhya Pradesh, now Uttar Pradesh, is doing exactly what Naina said. Working with district collectors, working with state governments, and saying, guys, let's put the girl child back in school. And if the schools are closed, let's do it in every mohalla and really get good education back. Because as we all know, an educated woman will solve many of the problems that we are facing in rural India today. So I think that's an example. Another entity that right here in Pune is Lighthouse Communities. They started in Pune just about 5 years ago. Today, 650 slum communities in urban Pune are impacted by people getting agency or aspiration and moving on to choosing the skills they want to learn rather than the skills that we want to teach them, and getting livelihoods. And today, the government in Delhi, the government in Odisha, everybody wants a similar model. And this again is, if you look at Safina's investments today in Educate Girls, it's entirely on analytics. They're working on when that girl 2 years later might drop out of school because of the ecosystem around her. If you look at Lighthouse Communities, it's all about predicting what will make this youth shine based on the parameters that he shows in the first 2 weeks of the program. So I think a lot of the solutions, healthcare, of course, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the $1 trillion digital India, it's not going to come from the IT sector. We are a proud $200 billion industry. It will grow to, let's say, $350 billion by 2025, 2026. So where's the $650 billion coming from? The $650 billion is coming from platforms like the one my friend Nandan Nilekani has done so brilliantly, because he took the JAM Trinity, Jandan Aadhaar Mobility, added UID to it, and suddenly it transformed. And today, if you look at UPI, UPI is quite honestly beating everybody, whether it's the Bharat Pays or the Paytms or the payment banks, and saying, hey, everything is being democratized. So you will have democratized technology-enabled education and skills. You certainly should have democratized access to healthcare, which thanks to COVID has begun to happen, because we all are okay with telemedicine, etc. So literally in every segment of the economy, and which is why I said earlier, so long as we focus on the digital, physical, and social infrastructure, and not just building roads and railways, which of course is essential, then I think we will see the beginnings of the infrastructure coming in, the technical or the digital infrastructure coming in, and almost every aspect of Fantush's life, whether it's educating his children, getting his own skills up, getting healthcare for his family, will get transformed. And that is truly the India we want to see.
Thank you, Ganesh. As you rightly said, one of the clear, unambiguous successes has been UPI, the India stack, over the last decade. But let me turn to kind of a challenge apart from technology and the role of the state. And just I would perhaps venture to say the biggest challenge India has and other emerging markets have in this post-pandemic world is jobs and employment and job creation. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Acharya to start this discussion. We've seen this as a more secular trend, Dr. Acharya, where labor force participation has been falling over decades, whatever data you use, NSS, ILO, CMI. And that's got accentuated in the pandemic. We've lost a couple of percentage points of working age population in the last 2 years. The more chronic question first, why are we struggling to create jobs? Is it that output has become more capital intensive? Is it that labor is becoming a less viable factor of production? Is it because of labor laws? Is it the lack of skills and education that you alluded to? Is it the fact that technology is just making capital more productive and capital more attractive? What combination of these factors do we need to reverse to jumpstart job creation?
That really is probably the biggest challenge facing us, especially as we speak today. As you know, Sajjid, in India today, something like out of our working age population, only about 37 or 37.5% actually have some sort of job, according to this is the latest CMI data. But there's no reason to think that whenever the government periodic labor force survey catches up, that will be very different. And that's here the real comparison is both with our own history, when this ratio was probably closer to 55% or thereabouts, and also when you compare to across large populous countries, particularly in Asia, whether it's China, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's even Bangladesh, Vietnam, we look pretty not good, because there that ratio, which is around 37% here, is closer to, as I said, varying between 50 to 60%. And China, of course, is one of the big separators on this. And so when you ask what needs to be done, which of these factors matter, my honest and truthful answer would be, I'm not really sure. It's not a good answer, but that's an honest answer as far as I'm concerned. Second, that I suspect all of the above, the ones that you all mentioned. One can see the labor demand inhibiting dimension of each of those factors. But what I don't know is, what weight to attach, and therefore where to focus as we go forward. So if one doesn't really know, my answer is try all of them and see what works, or even look across our rich diversity of states and see what works. Is it the right kind of education? Is it the flexibility of labor laws? Is it trying to do things in a more labor-intensive way, whether it's a service or a commodity which otherwise would not be thought of, or any number of these things. I don't have a kind of pat, here's the formula. And I think this challenge, by the way, is not post-pandemic, is not going to get easier. Because as you point out, that even across the world, even if many countries start off better in terms of employment ratios to working age population, they all face similar challenges going forward. And it'll be interesting to see how they resolve these. The second, of course, a very important thing to mention here is that we are perhaps unique or close to unique among large economies, where the share of the informal sector in total employment is north of 80%. Whether it's 85 or 87%, I don't know, but it's north of 80%. And that makes for even greater challenges. Now, why it's that high? Again, it's a bunch of factors, some of the ones you already mentioned, and how exactly that should be changed, one doesn't know. My one thought that I want to just mention in this regard is that we tend to downplay in discussions in India on the employment issue, which is clearly one of the biggest challenges we face, the role of foreign trade. We sort of see that as sort of in a different bucket out there. Oh, that's exports and imports. What's it got to do with employment? Economic theory and the experience of many countries in post-1950 tells us that if you get your policies roughly right, you can go a long way with using the world economy, the demand in the world economy for labor-intensive employment, which is something where, we just haven't been that good at. So that's not much of an answer, but that's all I can say.
But you've listed out all the key issues to focus on. In fact, that was going to be my question for Ajay on foreign trade and labor-intensive exports. But before I get there, I want to turn to Naina to ask this, yawning gap. So I think the latest data from the ILO in 2020 was male labor force participation had fallen, but is still 80%. But female labor force participation is 22%. That's a 48 percentage point gap between male and female labor force participation. Now, I know there are a variety of social, economic, governance issues, but Naina, from your vantage point, and this has been declining in India, what factors do you attribute to that?
Sajjid, it's tragic and at one level, maybe even a little puzzling, because there are some sectors, the BPO, IT sectors, etc., which have actually embraced women, and we see the percentages growing, banks, etc. So it's really a very mixed story. But I think the base of it lies that as long as society sees the woman as an earning member only as the number two earner, and the guy's job, both for his ego and for the fact that it is his role to go and earn first, as long as that remains, when the child falls sick at home or there's need at home or sick parents or whatever it be, it falls to the woman to take her place. And as long as society expects this, you will find that this, I think, trend does not go away. And we are a far cry from ensuring that equality, whether it is in the workplace where women earn less, or indeed these social pressures where the woman's job earning is seen as a secondary support to the family and seldom a primary earner therein. I think jobs, roles, we for ages had rules in our country which didn't help. I mean, even the same BPO sector I cite, Ganesh will remember, we had to fight as employers to allow women to do night shifts. They were quite okay to do night shifts. It was very easy to take care of their night shifts in terms of picking them up, dropping them back. But rules did not permit it. Shops and establishment acts. Why? Let the employer decide. Let the employee decide. Why should government know better in terms of what is available to women or not? I think we have a long ways to go. And at the base of it, it is also the security and infrastructure that we have. The countries where women do well across Southeast Asia, where women roam free. Cities like Bombay, which are pretty safe for women, you'll find that women's participation is just higher. The bai who comes to work in your home is not worried about how she's going to get raped on the way. So I think there's so much that is wrong in terms of the provision of very basic rights, the right to work, the right to walk free, the right to have a choice. It's only when women come together collectively under, say, the brilliant sort of work that groups like Seva have done, that they succeed, because they succeed collectively with the helping hand of not-for-profits and groups that support them. So we have a long way to go. And we have to just keep fighting, because I think, as all of you rightly pointed out at the outset, India is really losing its place in the way women progress down at the grassroots.
That's a sobering thought. Ajay, I'm going to kind of pick up on where Dr. Acharya left on the global economy and the role of exports. It seems that the traditional way to create, unskilled, labor-intensive jobs was exporting, whether it's China, whether it was parts of Asia, whether it's Bangladesh, right? Textiles, leather, gems and jewelry. Is that still the model that we need to follow? Is it too late now for us to get there? What do we need to do? Or should we be more agnostic about, goods versus services in terms of where the growth and the jobs will come from?
Yeah, I don't think we can afford to choose. I mean, we should certainly go full scale on the services sector, IT, and the big low-hanging fruit for me there is, of course, tourism, where we have less tourists than the city of Paris does, for the whole country. So anyway, but coming back to your question, I think we have a natural experiment going on in the subcontinent. Our labor laws were inherited from, it's actually just before British independence, so we can actually blame it on, as a colonial set of laws, which we kind of inherited and then messed up further and further. Both India and Pakistan made a mess of the laws we inherited from the British, and then we added more bells and whistles to them. So our labor laws, but then came Bangladesh, and Bangladesh threw them all aside. And look where they are now. Not only in terms of exports, but also in terms of very sharp increase. It's the only country in South Asia where you see a very sharp increase in female labor force participation rate. And it's so striking, that despite the same set of cultural problems and issues, you have this huge increase because you have a massive increase in demand especially for girls in the textile sector. So they may not be working in great conditions in the city of Dhaka and near Dhaka, but from where they were coming from backbreaking work in the farms, this is a huge, huge improvement. And this is a story that has been seen in East Asia again and again and again. So I do think and Shankar listed them all very well, but that's one big area, that the most abundant resource that we have a set of laws that makes it so hard to actually people to get genuine employment. And in this case, of course, trade-related employment. And Bangladesh now, textile firms are 6-7 times larger on average than the Indian textile firms. So we can go the Bangladesh way on a massive scale were we to want to be able to do that. So I don't think that bus has yet left, and especially as firms move out of China, we have not been able to take advantage of that. And other countries like Vietnam, etc., have been able to take advantage of that. But I would also go back to something Naina said in the beginning, which is the financial sector. In our book, we show that we have the most inefficient financial sector in the world. The intermediation costs of our banking system are as high as 500 to 600 basis points. In Bangladesh, it's 400 basis points. In China, it's 250 to 300 basis points. Even in Pakistan, it's only 450 basis points. And what's the cause of that? The cause of this huge rise in NPLs. And the only way the banking sector can absorb those costs is through very high intermediation costs. And that's where we are missing out on the increase. Our credit to GNP ratio is only about 50%. In Vietnam, it's now 120%. So, the system is not even providing enough credit to the economy. And whatever credit is being provided in a very unequal manner. So there's a large swath of of our economic activity which does not have access to credit. So that's another huge factor that needs to be.
Thank you, Ajay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ajay. The paradox may kind of emerge here because exports did grow 15% a year for almost 10 years between 2002 and 2011, despite the labor laws. But I think it's important to clarify that that was a period of hyper-globalization, right? So a rising tide was lifting all boats, and we were the beneficiaries of that. I think, as you point to, now comes the harder slog of increasing market share in global merchandise exports, which means increasing competitiveness. And we've been stuck around that 1.7 to 2% mark for merchandise exports. Interestingly, service exports, India's share of service exports has been rising every year for the last 4 or 5 years, but that creates more kind of upper skilled white collar jobs. It doesn't address the unskilled jobs that we need, the lower skilled jobs. Ganesh, let me turn to, again, kind of the role of technology in all of this, because, Digital India, presumably all of the startups we hear and the IT sector, there's a big paradox in the labor market as we speak, that if you're an IT firm, it's very hard to find a worker, wages are surging, demands exceeding supply, and side by side, you have a lot of people, 24 million households demanding NREGA. So it seems a very segmented labor market. The organized sector is doing very well, the informal sector is not. But if you just extend that forward, that if you get Digital India creating more of these skilled white collar jobs, is that labor substituting at some point, like all technological progress is? And then is the question, we need to do better reskilling so that the people that lose out from that can get employed somewhere else?
Sajjid, there used to be this. I remember 15 years ago, we had a discussion in the Confederation of Indian Industry, where somebody said, let China do all the manufacturing and we will do all the services. I mean, it is just not going to work. When I go back to what Ajay said, we have to make sure that manufacturing jobs are created. I mean, we can't keep seeing manufacturing as a percentage of GDP slipping all the time. Let's face it, guys. I mean, I'm part of a much hyped IT services industry. Even today, we employ less than 50 lakh people. And I'm talking about 40 crore people who are to be put to work. So there is no way we're going to solve the employment problem of the country. Now, honestly, we've had a free run because the labor laws that have been alluded to have been largely on the manufacturing sector. Net result, no manufacturing company worth the name employs directly. They employ through contractors with all the exploitation that entails. So that needs to be solved. We have to, you heard about, there was this big scandal in one of the southern electronics component manufacturing facilities because the hostels in which the women were staying was abysmal. So I think we have to make sure that, we are able to create reasonable quality. I'm not going to high quality manufacturing jobs, even agriculture. Just to give you an example, I've been a great fan of China for 30 years, built 2 very successful companies there. And 5 years back, I started work with a client in Shenzhen who employed these, typical 3,000 Chinese women who would come in at 8 in the morning, take 2 breaks for maybe 10 minutes each and slog right through the day. Just before COVID, I was there in 2018, and the same factory today employs only 400 women, but they have 1,200 low-cost automation robots, and the people have been reskilled to work with them. So they're changing their model as we speak. So, if you ask me, can we now replicate what China did, which was moving people from the farms into the factories and, making toys and clothes and electronics? Sorry, that train has left the station. But we need to find new models of manufacturing. I was talking to Jayant Sinha the other day. With the Prime Minister's commitment of zero carbon, etc., I think there's a huge amount of green economy jobs that are going to get created. So we're going to work on that. We've got to look at alternate energy, look at where the jobs will be created. But we cannot go back and say, let's replicate what Bangladesh has done. And quite honestly, I know Bangladesh pretty well, but I think if you go into some of the textile factories in Dhaka and Chittagong, we don't want India to go like that. But we certainly want reasonable quality jobs to be created. And as I said, it is going to be manufacturing. It is going to be the kind of intersection between manufacturing and design services, which we all believe is where India's next wave will come from. But don't leave it only to services. That's not going to happen. It's not good for the economy. And one last point I want to make is that, I am actually very worried about what's happening thanks to COVID to even young people in this country. Today, I think there was an Economic Times, Arundhati Bhattacharya or somebody talking about, people moonlighting, which is, there are people who are working for 2 large corporations full-time at the same time. Work from home, log in. I mean, you're not measured on output and you're just kind of there. And there is no ethical thing. I mean, even one of my former colleagues was telling me how nicely she is working on a full-time job in payroll in one company and moonlighting on the side for her previous company. And I was telling her, look, I mean, don't you feel a sense of shame around doing this? She says, no, I'm doing the work and I'm getting 2 jobs. So how does it matter? So I'm saying the whole ethical construct of young people has to be changed. And we have to show that, look, you can build a country that people don't have to cut corners all the time to make it happen. So I'm really worried about that point. The other point that Naina said, I mean, I remember when I took over my CEO role in Zensar, the classical, 42% were women entering the workforce. When I looked at my management team, out of 12 people, only the legal head was a woman. And I actually set out to say, let me solve this problem. And we solve the problem not by educating the men, which of course is very important, don't get me wrong, but understanding what really inhibited the women. I mean, Lalita Gupta did a fantastic job in ICICI, which is why so many women, and of course, Naina herself is a classic example. But I'm saying we figured that the worm lay in their heads. My mother-in-law told me that your son is not doing well in school. Lost 1% out of 97 because you weren't there at home with him. Bang, she gives up her job and sits at home. Today's generation, I mean, if you look at the young people getting married, I think the marriage contract is very simple. Buddy, you do half the work, I do half the work. And keep your mother out of this picture. Generation will come and that will, I think, solve that problem. But when we started addressing this point and working with, I remember we worked with 75 young women. When I left Zensar, out of 18 people in senior management, 13 were women. By a conscious effort of giving them the self-confidence, saying, of course, you build your family, build your home, but also don't drop out of work. And I think that's important. Of course, it's a completely different kettle of fish when you go to rural India, and that's a different problem. But we've got to solve these problems. We have to get women's participation in the workforce. We have to get entrepreneurs to succeed. There was a question on the chat on when in India do innovation. I mean, why do you short sell India? Just because we don't make a Facebook or a Google, it doesn't mean we don't innovate. I mean, companies like Infosys and TCS are doing innovation in services all the time. I'm saying we can innovate, we can get young people to come, but we have to build, as I said, an ethical, moral fabric in which this country grows.
Thank you, Ganesh. We have 1 hour, 14 minutes into a very rich discussion. I think we've barely scratched the surface, but we've got 17 questions. I'm going to pick a few of these in the interest of time. We have about 15 minutes left. The first one is an anonymous question. The question is, and I'll maybe direct this to Ajay, is it a fair comparison to make between India and East Asian economies, since India is a huge democracy with electoral politics, whereas East Asia are mostly technocratic? Ajay?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question is very often being raised, and they have the political system they have, and we have the political system we have. And yes, it is much harder in a rambunctious democracy, like I said, to do reforms. But we have done reforms in the past, right? We had the 91 reforms on the back of a crisis when we had not even a very the government didn't have too much of a majority even in parliament. We did those reforms. So I think now more and more I do feel that if the elections, there was a period when a lot of elections were won by handing out freebies and things like that. But increasingly, I think performance does matter. Performance in terms of delivery of basic services to people. So I am still a very firm believer that even with the kind of democratic system we have, and I'm very proud of it, that's not something we want to lose, that more and more as people determine the outcome of our election system through performance, we will be pushing the governments towards these kind of reforms that we have talked about so much. I think this is something that, yes, it will be more difficult, but I think in the end you will have greater consensus. And I think the way not to do reforms is what was done with the recent farm laws, where they were just rammed through parliament without any adequate discussion, and look where we ended up. It is a lesson in how not to do reforms. So, but I do think slowly and like an elephant, not like a tiger, India will move on in that direction. And there is a sort of a broad consensus and a discussion around what are the priorities on which this has to take place.
Thank you, Ajay. There's a question that I'm going to direct to Naina from Shamadas Banerjee. Now, the question is, climate change will exacerbate water problems, which is already visible. Is there a national program which coordinates with states to deal with this crisis?
So I don't know if it's at a national level as much as I think planning for resilience, and we have to face this every day, and it predates climate change awareness. Floods are a key issue. I think what we have to really look at is what have we destroyed for ourselves, not blame the world for carbon going up, but really what have we destroyed in terms of our forests, our water collection points, our marshlands. We build in this ad hoc fashion, and our urban planning is what is dismal. The good news is, and it was announced even in this budget, that there is at least some allocation towards urban institutions, urban planning. And I think if we can look at proper planning of our cities to start with, which are really what destroy environment, because we build on areas which are natural flood control areas. That is one. Second is, agriculture and the way we address agriculture along riverine areas and flood control of our rivers. The hydrology of a river is so important that we must have enough flow in a river to make sure that it doesn't get polluted, but by the same token, ensure that we aren't building on the river in a way that does not allow the river to cope with its own, as it will, swell and flow. Damming of rivers, we do a lot that's wrong as we go into the whole area of now looking at flood control, which is important, and it isn't about damming rivers. So there is a huge amount of energy actually, and quite exciting to hear some of the Namami Ganga projects and the understanding of rivers, river flows, the desire to open up rivers for transportation. All of this will help us to address what is really what are national assets in a way that do not become national disasters for us. But it can only happen by looking at it through urban planning, forestry, reforestry, and rivers and planning therein. What happens in terms of the swell of the sea and the sea rising, we will have to live with it. We must know that there are low-lying areas, whether it's the Sundarbans or Bangladesh or areas of Bombay, that will maybe 50 years from now not survive. So let's build for it in a way that we will be able to withstand what we know are going to be the disasters of tomorrow, because we are not going to be able to contain climate change at the level that it is required to. And if we do, then we will have less to worry about. But if we don't, at least we won't see people washed away as these disasters come along.
Thank you, Naina. There's a question specifically directed to Dr. Shankar Acharya. It's a broad question, Acharya. The question is there a measure of, quote, state efficiency, unquote, that one can look at to see how well the bureaucracy of the government is performing on delivery? In other words, were they better in 2000 than now in assisting with reforms and growth? I know it's a broad question, but it's directed to you.
Well, thank you, Sajjid, and I thank the questioner. But I'm afraid I didn't give any guarantee that I'd have an answer always to a question. And this is one of those questions I don't have an answer that I would want to somehow make up. I don't know.
Can I just add a bit to it?
Please, Ajay. Please do.
So yeah, having looked at these measures of state capacity, yes, there are. They are perception-based surveys, so they ask business people, they ask citizens, and we put a lot of them in our book. There's actually Azim Premji University has done a very good survey of listing, also institutions by how people rate different institutions within a government. But internationally, there are measures across over time, and we have looked at how, as I said, they are perception-based indicators. Now, there are also individual indicators, like you can go to the customs service and say, how long does it take to get my goods out of customs? How long does it take to turn around things at a port? So within a government, you can have also more concrete measures. There are also like logistics indices that the World Bank produces on various types of logistics indicators. So there's a bunch of this stuff out there that one can look at to judge performance, but there's nothing perfect out there.
Sajjid, can I just add one thing?
Please.
Which is really not a direct answer to the very good question asked, but I think I want to get it on the table anyway for the benefit of everybody, which is that we haven't touched on this topic. That's why I'm diverting a bit. We haven't touched on the very important area of what we economists call fiscal policy, or taxes and expenditures. I know we've had a budget about 8 or 9 days ago. I think it's exactly a week ago, actually. But one of the things that I think we have to recognize that as we go forward, that is incumbent upon us as a nation to do, is to increase the ratio of taxes to GDP in India. And much of this increase will have to come at the central level, where it has stagnated for probably a quarter of a century, about 10, 11% of GDP. Because, yes, we should do all the re-engineering of administration and government that people are talking about, and that's possible. But ultimately, you also have to fund all this. And I think we are one of those countries which have relied for far too long on essentially running large fiscal deficits to fund our basic expenditure needs at both levels of government. And this is simply not sustainable. As an aside, Naina mentioned about how we have to raise our game in the area of corporate debt markets. Well, that's never going to happen, in my opinion, as long as we run, such high levels of fiscal deficit to GDP, because it means that you're awash with sovereign paper. And why should people take non-sovereign risk when there's so much sovereign paper around at a pretty good price?
Acharya, you stole the last question I was going to direct to you from Jagjit Singh, which is exactly that. Okay. What can be done to increase the tax to GDP ratio? I would say this is crucial. We never had a chance to touch on a variety of things: fiscal, health, education. We could spend another 3 hours easily doing this. And it's an important point, Acharya, because apart from crowding out the corporate bond market, there's a real issue of fiscal dominance that the RBI faces now as we begin to normalize monetary policy. Arguably, given that our total public sector borrowing is still close to 11% of GDP, it has to come down closer to 6% of GDP. The question in the next 5 years is, how do you fund all these investments in health, education, and still bring the deficit down? And the answer has to be raise tax to GDP.
Yeah.
And I would argue you need a direct tax code at some point in the coming years to broaden the base, take away the exemptions, rationalize rate, and also rationalize the GST, because GST rates today are much below what revenue neutral rates were. So that's a whole package of fiscal issues we need to contemplate. But we've run out of time, so I'm going to request that we close the discussion with one final round. This is looking forward. And so may I ask each of the panelists to just give us priorities for the next 5 years. And it's easy to give a laundry list, so I'm going to be a little harder and ask for people to give just 1 or 2 or 3 priorities and how those should be sequenced in the next 5 years, given that both state capacity and political capital is finite. If there were 3 things that we really had to focus on as a country over the next 5 years, what would those be and in what sequence? Sorry for imposing these restrictions, because I think it'll be a more interesting and rich discussion if we impose some of these constraints. So should I start or in the reverse order this time? Ganesh, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I think very simply, those 3 things, and I mentioned it already. First, of course, is boost up the manufacturing economy. We need to create more manufacturing jobs. The second is what you would expect me to say, which is really use the enormous leverage we have with digital and the amount of digital talent that is available in the country to really build digital solutions for India. We are very good at building digital solutions for America, but what about our own home turf? And the third, which to me is the most important, has to be inclusive. It has to include every class, every community, every strata of society, and only then we can be proud of India.
Thank you, Ganesh. Naina, may I turn to you? 3 policy priorities? Yeah.
I would, Saj, just focus on something which was not mentioned, which is competitiveness of Indian industry. It goes beyond labor. It has to do with every aspect of, interest costs, logistics costs, turnaround time at ports, etc., etc. So the competitiveness of Indian industry is going to be very critical. The second is outcomes and measurement of projects. We have very long only focused on spending, and even the focus on, the way we look at the budget is how much is government spending on ABC. But, audits, outcomes, analysis of that spend would be very, very critical. And the third is to look at everything we spend and do through a lens of job creation. And that brings me to this huge capex spend, which is anticipated now. Within it, and I was just asking Shankar for his wisdom and advice on which aspects of capex would actually be the biggest in terms of job creation. So to understand where we spend money and try and do it in a way that we can get the most bang for the buck, so to speak, in terms of job creation.
Thank you very much, Naina. Ajay?
Yeah, so I would, 3 things if I had to choose. I would say we have to find a way through higher taxes. And by the way, property taxes are very low in India and clearly, the low-hanging fruit to increase revenue. But we have to increase spending on health and public spending on health and education. So I would start by saying, let's start increasing that by 0.5% of GDP every year for the next 5 years. So that's one. The other is, I think, Naina said it also, I think we have focused too much on this concept of the ease of doing business. Even the World Bank has decided that they're no longer going to support that indicator. And we have to focus on the costs of doing business. And that comes from, as she said, also land, labor, financial sector. Then, when you just look at even our electricity pricing, it is so much against the business sector. We are very uncompetitive when we supply electricity to business, but we are obviously subsidizing consumers. So there's a whole slew of issues which we can, under the rubric of the cost of doing business, which is very important. And the third thing that I would focus a lot on would be this on, how do we now avoid going deeper and deeper into protectionism, and how do we find ways to enter trade agreements now? I mean, we haven't gone into RCEP. We are talking about agreements with USA, EU, and others. But unless we begin to find a way to engage, the rest of the world is going to get carved up into these arrangements, and we will be left out of it. I think we need to move more aggressively on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. I'll end with Dr. Acharya.
Okay, thank you, Sajjid. Very quickly, first, I would say that we really have to do systemic reform on our basic education, primary and secondary. What exactly that means, I do not have enough knowledge or the time at this point to tell you, but we obviously have to improve the really abysmal learning outcomes that we are currently getting. And I leave it to the experts how that's to be done. Second, I think I will simply repeat, or rather not repeat, but ditto what Ajay has just said on our foreign trade policy. We have to engage much more aggressively, intelligently, and well, whether it's in the domain of multilateralism, regionalism, mega-regionals, or bilateral. I mean, we just can't just hide behind walls because that gets us nowhere. And lastly, to repeat, we do need to worry about fiscal consolidation sooner rather than later. And that inevitably, in my view, means raising the tax GDP ratio. It doesn't necessarily mean raising tax rates. It may involve also new taxes. And sometimes people may not like the sound of that, but that's what we need to do.
Wow, this is a very rich policy agenda for the next quarter of a century. Clearly there's an element of reorienting the state. Several of you spoke about the need for more health, more education, for more capital expenditure. At the same time, we have to bring fiscal deficits down. So that would mean raising our tax to GDP ratio. We have to be very careful not to become more protectionist. And I think two other overarching themes was increase the competitiveness of Indian business, right? So that's how manufacturing and industry will become more globally competitive, and also enable better digital solutions, as Ganesh says. This is a very rich policy agenda. I think if the government can do a critical fraction of this in the coming years, we'll be in very good stead for the next quarter of a century. But let me use that, I know we're 3 minutes over, to thank this wonderful, rich discussion by our panelists, Naina, Ganesh, Ajay, Dr. Acharya. It's been a real pleasure moderating this panel. Thank you all, and goodbye to everyone for tuning in today. Bye-bye.